So the first one I want to address is how can you tell the difference between disorganized attachment and anxious attachment? So before I preface my response to this, it's really important to understand that attachment styles, I have found the best way to conceptualize attachment styles is as responses of the nervous system, okay? And responding in fight, flight, freeze, or you might say fawn mode. I lump fawn in the category of fighting for the relationship, okay? Or because you're not always fighting for a relationship, what you're fighting for is proximity, safe proximity. One way to understand this is to understand these things exist on a continuum. So there is some debate in the world of attachment theory as to whether these things should be discussed categorically, as most of us understand them, or on a continuum, right? So we'll do a couple diagrams for this. So you've got, let's say you have high anxiety, and then we have low anxiety. We have, let's call this low avoidance. And we have high avoidance. Okay, so low to high anxiety, low to high avoidance. Okay, so I'm going to move so you can see this better. So I would like you to try to imagine conceptualizing these things in this way. Okay, so if you're someone who has high anxiety but low avoidance, then you're more likely to be in, I like to call these folks open hearts because they tend to wear their heart on their sleeve, but you're more anxious, okay? Anxious preoccupied, anxious ambivalent. If you're way over here, you're more likely anxious, what's called anxious preoccupied. If you're like over here, because you have a little bit of avoidance, and usually that comes from a sense of awareness about yourself, honestly, you're more ambivalent. Anxious ambivalent, okay? Now, if you have low avoidance and low anxiety, this is considered to be secure. I call these folks cornerstones, okay? If you have high anxiety and you have high avoidance, this is considered disorganized. What a terrible word, right? I like to call this spice of life, spice of lifers. Other words you'll find in literature, which basically means the same thing, is fearful avoidant, anxious avoidant, disordered attachment. They're all describing the same thing, which is a high degree of anxiety and a high degree of avoidance. In other words, when you put high avoidance and high anxiety together, you're very ambivalent, right? You don't, there's a lot of inner conflict. Now, when the conflict gets high enough, when moving towards something or clinging in fighting for proximity to someone close to you that makes you feel safe doesn't eliminate the threat, or moving away, avoiding, withdrawing, pulling away, putting distance between yourself and the threat doesn't solve the problem, then none of the fight or flight responses are solving the problem to the threat that you're facing. Then what happens? You freeze. You shut down, right? And I would say that if we are looking for what's the difference between anxious attachment and disorganized attachment, it is that people who have disorganized attachment are more likely to experience a dissociative state. We would call it a pathological dissociative state, but that is just a fancy word for saying a dissociative state that numbs you out, have an out-of-body experience. Your hippocampus shuts down, your amygdala turns up the volume, your adrenaline kicks in, and the information about what you are experiencing is not able to be processed and organized properly in your neocortex and upper regions of your brain, because the entirety of your body is telling you that you need to focus on survival right now. And your attachment styles are essentially represented by a continuum of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are determined to be appropriate based on context, based on your genetic disposition, your temperament, and also based on what resources are accessible and available to you. So in other words, in that moment, with what is available to you and considering the nature of the threat, which of these coping skills are going to get you what you need to feel safe, right? Incidentally, if there's high avoidance and low anxiety, this is more dismissive avoidance. I call these folks rolling stones. Now, the reason I find the continuum explanation a lot more palatable is because it allows for the dimensionality of experience, also the transience of experience, right? Because we can see here that there's a range, like there's a range in here. You can be, even when you're secure, you can be a little more anxious at times, you can be a little more avoidant at times. So there's a range that we move around in, right? So there's a lot of different things. And so maybe if you're acting a little more avoidant on this day, then this is going to appear to be far less than someone who is over here, right? So you might misinterpret this person as avoidant because you're way up over here. So from your perspective, someone down here, even though they're primarily secure, because they tend to lean a little more avoidant on that day, and you're way over here, their experience is going to look a lot different than yours, right? But the thing is we grow up in systems and in environments that are usually unchanging, and systems don't like change in and of themselves. So when you grow up in environments where people, places, and things are relatively consistent in the messages that they tell you, and you might have a genetic predisposition towards anxiety or avoidance based on your dopamine or serotonin, right? The way your genes express themselves around dopamine or serotonin, which is what Omri Gillis research tells us in epigenetics, then you might have a proclivity to hang out in one of these ranges more often than not. There's a frequency of attitude, thought, and behavior that occurs, and it becomes reinforced by environments, people, places, and things that do not change. Okay? So over time, that carves a very deep groove in your limbic brain and nervous system. Now, so when we talk about, well, what's the difference? The difference, I think, is primarily that for folks that are fearfully avoidant, they will have experienced such a degree of trauma in their lives, whether that is incidental or developmental, that they also experience a dissociative shutdown. In other words, it's the presence of dissociation. Some research says peridissociation, which means how much do you dissociate at the time that the trauma occurred. The more that exists, research has borne out, the more likely it is going to lead to dysfunctional dissociation down the line. Now, dysfunctional dissociation is, as I said before, your feelings numb out. Maybe you're enthralled with somebody one moment and suddenly they start getting close to you and suddenly your feelings shut off. You have no more sexual attraction to them anymore. You could even still regard them as an admirable person, but you just are not aroused by them anymore. The magic is gone, inexplicably, right? Or you might, the other way that this can present itself, there are narrative discrepancies in the way you don't remember things very well. It's hard for you to put together a chronological narrative of your experience. You may say and do things that you later forget, and it's an unconscious thing. It often can be experienced as things like gaslighting, and it can certainly affect that experience. But for folks that are really severely traumatized, their hippocampus is not tagging that information correctly, so it's not being integrated into a cohesive narrative, right? And this affects memory, okay? There's also just a general sense of being numbed out, and then it will swing back and forth between that kind of depersonalization, derealization, and then there will be a wave of emotion and then you explode, and it will feel difficult to regulate that experience, right? And there's an impulsivity to it. Now, someone who's anxious can explode, but usually someone who's more anxious, what they've been doing is they've been suppressing, telling themselves they're burdened, they're too needy, they're too much. If I express this, my partner will reject me, and they're suppressing, and then they kind of explode because that turns into a pressure cooker. So yes, disorganized folks can explode, but it's usually impulsive. It emerges in the moment, and then it can be followed by a dissociative shutdown because they freaked themselves out with the dysregulation that just came out, and then their system shuts off, right? So it's the fight, and then it's the flee, and then it's, oh my God, neither of those things are working. Now I'm going to shut down and freeze, right? So in other words, you will see some anxious behaviors pop up in someone who struggles, a spice of lifer who struggles with disorganized attachment. But for them, there's a more severe sort of paradoxical presentation. Okay. Can you be secure but go through periods of anxiety? Absolutely. Absolutely. I would reference back to our discussion about attachment styles as existing on a continuum, and remembering that that when we are responding to attachment threats, it's the nervous system responding in fight or flight mode, fighting for the relationship versus flying away until it's safe to come back, or freeze in instances of severe threat, right? Where fighting or flying, nothing seems to work, right? And even folks, and this is actually how and why, even if you had a secure upbringing, you can still wind up in insecure relationships, or you can still wind up with an insecure attachment style after having a particularly insecure partner. Because how did you become insecure in the first place? Well, you encountered an insecure parent, right, who demonstrated that behavior for you. So, and your nervous system responded. So a secure adult can encounter insecure people, and if they're not aware of how insecure people operate, they may approach that relationship from within a secure paradigm and perspective, which maybe didn't have the same experiences that these folks had to make them so insecure, right? So they may start to rationalize someone else's behavior in the way that children do, not immaturely, but generously, right? Well, why would somebody not like themselves? Why would somebody think they'd done something wrong? What, I must have suggested that to them somehow. And now you start to feel gaslighted, right? But it's just like, because when you come from something with the wisdom of a child, it's kind of like all of that crap is just not there, right? Which can make them, which can make a secure folk person really attractive and charming and inviting. But if they haven't had exposure and or an understanding of how and why these things evolve differently for someone else, they may take more on themselves than they should. And now in their adult existence, they are being pushed in insecure directions because they're not aware of what's going on under the surface, right? So they'll start to experience attachment threats, and they may start to respond to them in whatever way they're being polarized by the other attachment style, right? So someone who's avoidant and anticipates that someone's going to demand too much of them, this is what projected introjects are, anticipates that. So they, instead of waiting for it to happen, they will head it off, right, by inexplicably disappearing, because they sense that you're getting closer. And as you get closer, they're like, oh God, they're going to start asking me things that I don't want to give. You know what? I'm going to end this now. No harm, no foul. Before expectations are out of control, you end it. The other person didn't make demands on you. They didn't say anything that was out of the ordinary. So they're kind of like, what happened? And the avoidant person is like, feels overly sensitive to their question, because that means they're going to have to justify something that is painful for them to anticipate or painful for them to express. So they ghost. And then now the secure person is completely unfamiliar with that kind of response, right? So then they start like hunting down the response, because they're willing to take ownership of what they did wrong, and they want to correct it, if not with this person, then the next person, because that's how you learn. Because when you make a mistake, you pick yourself up and you keep going, right? Because that's what secure people do. But the avoidant person feels like, oh, now they've just become the thing I knew they would be. They're hounding me, they're chasing me, I knew this was going to happen, right? But they induced that by anticipating it. That's a projected introject, right? And anxious people do the same thing. I know he's going to abandon me. I know he's going to leave me. I know that he didn't respond to me within the past hour because he's probably cheating on me and talking to somebody else. Oh my God, he liked that girl's picture, and that must mean that he's talking to her while he's talking to me at the same time. And you know what? I'm going to head this off, and you explode over some little thing that has nothing to do with what you were talking about, and then you're sort of hounding them around something they haven't actually done yet. and they feel overwhelmed by you and like, whoa, like I'm going to put some space between us because you're overwhelming me with all the stuff that I didn't do. And now you're feeling pushed away and you're like, see, I knew it. You were going to push me away and you were going to dump me for someone else, and I knew that you'd like me in the beginning, and I'm boring you, aren't I? And so now we are inducing that response in the other person, right? So this can happen whether you had a difficult childhood or not. You can be a secure person and fall into that dynamic if your partner has a lot of energy and momentum caught up in their stories, right? In their insecurities, and that partner can induce that within you through things like projected introjects, right? So anyway, I hope that answers your question. So the answer is yes. Secure folks can have avoidant or anxious leanings when they are under attachment threats. The difference is when the threat is alleviated, they go back to equilibrium. When the threat is alleviated, like, whew, I'm glad we figured that out. Whereas for someone who falls into the category of avoidant or anxious or disorganized, the reassurance lasts for a day, and then they sort of back that fan that's whirring in the background, the sort of anxious or avoidant fan that's telling you all the stories about the way the world works and how lovers will eventually disappoint you or you'll eventually disappoint them. That fan gets turned back on the next day because it hasn't been enough to recalibrate your nervous system. That reassurance was great in the moment, but tomorrow your nervous system's like, okay, back on again. Time for another show, right? And so this is why if you struggle with insecure attachment, you must have embodied interventions if you're ever going to make progress. It's just, if you're not addressing this on the body level, your changes are going to be context dependent, meaning you're constantly relying on the reassurance you're receiving from someone else, which means you're dependent on an external circumstance. And the thing is, life happens. Shit changes. Things evolve and grow. And it's gonna feel like your pillars, your stilts, your supports are toppled underneath you, right? So when we want to develop a lasting sense of security, it's actually an internal job. And of course, our partners can be helpful advocates along the way, but the full responsibility of showing up and being honest with yourself and with them is an inner job, right? It's an inside job.